Hey fam, I want you to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications.
50 people were murdered last week in 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. The shooter was a self-described white nationalist, or as we call them on Roland Martin Unfiltered, a racist white terrorist. In his racist manifesto, the shooter cites Donald Trump as a symbol of renewed white identity and common purpose. Trump downplays white nationalism as a threat.
I don't really. I think it's a small group of people that have very, very serious problems. I guess if you look at what happened in New Zealand, perhaps that's a case. I don't know enough about it yet. They're just learning about the person and the people involved. But it's certainly a terrible thing, terrible thing.
Yeah, those few people can sure do a lot of damage. 50 people at mosques in New Zealand, 9 people at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, 11 people at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, 2 people at that Kroger supermarket parking lot in Kentucky. And that's not all. Right-wing extremists were linked to at least 50 murders last year, a 35% increase over 2017, according to the Anti-Defamation League that tracks these events. And there are reports that the House Judiciary Committee will hold hearings in the next few weeks on the rise of white nationalism. Of course, the big question is Trump to blame for the rise of white nationalism and white nationalist violence? Before we ask the panel about this, here is what David Leonhardt of the New York Times wrote this morning. Drawing a direct line from the purveyors of hateful rhetoric to any specific hate crime is usually impossible, and it's usually a mistake to try. The motive for these crimes, be it in New Zealand last week or Pittsburgh last year, is typically a stew of mental illness, personal anger, and mixed up ideology. Trump doesn't deserve to be blamed for any specific crime, but he does deserve to be blamed for the trend. It's very complicated. The man with the world's largest bully pulpit keeps encouraging violence and white nationalism. Lo and behold, white nationalist violence is on the rise. You have to work pretty hard to persuade yourself that's just a big coincidence. So joining us on the panel today to talk about it is Monique Presley, a legal analyst and crisis manager, Michael Brown, former vice chair of the DNC Finance Committee, and Eugene Craig, CEO of the Eugene Craig Organization. Welcome.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, appreciate it.
So what are your thoughts about what's going on here? You know, to me, it's very interesting that Trump was specifically named in the manifesto, yet he keeps acting as if, why am I even mentioned in the same breath as this murderer? What are your thoughts on his responsibility for these acts?
Well, of course he has responsibility, but it's the same as everything else that he has responsibility for, and he's taken none. He's supposedly the president of the United States, the so-called leader of the free world, and he's never accepted that mantle. He has continued to behave over and over again like an infant. You know, I mean, he has such juvenile behavior. He does things that my young children think are just absurd. So for him to actually accept responsibility for the fact that the hate that he puts out can lead to an extreme group of people taking action, no, I'm not surprised at all that he is unwilling to do that.
Absolutely. And Michael, not so long ago, you remember when he came out and called himself a nationalist? You know, it's very interesting that he specifically used that language. And now we have this yet another murderous action by a white nationalist. He's still trying to say, oh, I had nothing to do with that.
Well, first, Dr. Avis, let me first commend you for coming in hurt and sick and doing a wonderful job. Roland, if you're watching, look what a professional.
I'm trying to figure out what Avis is turning up. That's what I probably need to be.
But you know, I'm sure someone has kept count, whether it's the Anti-Defamation League, but it seems to me there are so few attacks by Arab Americans,
right,
or Arabs, or however the president liked to refer to them, and more by just white people.
Absolutely.
By white men that just want to go to a hotel, open up a window, and start shooting people in a crowd. That's terrorism.
It is.
And every time this happens, he ignores it because, you know, clearly he knows that he's part of the problem. I don't think he ever thought people would really go to this level. Clearly he wants to inspire his people.
Right.
But I don't think he ever thought people would go out with guns and start killing people. But that's what they're doing.
What do you think, Eugene?
I think he actually does, to be honest with you. I mean, if you go back to the campaign, you know, literally at the rallies, he would say, you know, hey, you know, back in my day, you know, they can get
right.
beat up and taken out in the stretcher. And he would tell his folk, you know, well, if you beat them up, I'll pay your legal bills. I think it's kind of irrational to expect the trash-ass racist to, you know, kind of rebuke other trash-ass racists.
That's true.
And, you know, when you have folk that are committing crimes and killing people and literally bringing the white supremacy and white supremacist terrorism to real lives, you can't, I mean, I thought it was weird. And then I had to take a step back that Mick Mulvaney's first response to, you know, the question of should the president give a speech denouncing white supremacy is, oh, the president's not a white supremacist.
Yeah.
Oh, he doesn't not like Muslims.
Well, Eugene, we have a little clip from Mick Mulvaney. Let's see what he said. Let's look at his excuse.
The president is not a white supremacist. I'm not sure how many times we have to say that.
You have to say it until he starts acting like he's not, because clearly he's been acting like he's not from day one. What I find that he is from day one. What I find very interesting is one of the first things that this administration did was they cut funding for being able to track white nationalist, white supremacist groups. At the very same time, they established this ridiculous focus on black identity extremists.
Yeah.
We've known for the last 3 years, we have seen increases in white nationalist violence. We've seen a 17% increase in white nationalist violence just between last year and this year. The problem is here. The problem is getting worse. They're wasting resources looking for black folks when it's these crazy, I wouldn't even say crazy, that gives them an out.
No,
Evil white men killing people of color, killing Jewish people all over this nation and the world. When will we correct what's gone horribly wrong with this administration? What can we do as citizens to move this administration and let them know that they need to change their focus?
All right, well, the trend for this homebred terror for young white men, especially young white men between the ages of 18 and 24, predates the Trump administration. And they've been studying it supposedly for a while. And I do think, yes, it's kind of like axis of evil-ish, but there is sickness. And they have not figured out what's going wrong with that demographic that is leading to them being the predominant factor. I mean, we don't even have to guess now. When we see that there's been some mass shooting, we pretty much know what that's about. And it doesn't look anything like everything this administration is flagging. But what this administration is doing is just feeding the base.
Right.
I mean, they just feed the monster and feed the monster and feed the monster, and it has not. They're not tethered to facts.
Right.
You know, they don't believe in data or science or any of those things. It doesn't matter. Down is up and up is down. So whatever it is that serves their purpose of the day or the moment, that's what they go with, and that could change tomorrow.
Well, this is an administration that's been full of white supremacists. Look, Malcolm Nance talked to Roland about this. We will listen to that, and then we'll come back and continue the discussion.
Really to understand that we're operating in white fear right now. We've always had that. But the reality is, with America becoming a nation, majority people of color in 2043, you look at what's happening in France and other countries, there's all this fervor when it comes to immigration. This is really white folks globally being afraid of the future, what the demographics look like.
You're absolutely right. And it's not a recent fear. This is certainly in the United States with the white supremacy movement. Well, technically, you could say that its heyday was the U.S. Civil War. But in the period afterwards, and, you know, with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and then the civil, you know, as it descended into the civil rights movement, the 1950s were actually very, very significant in terms of intellectualizing the fear of immigrants, blacks, browns, and others in the United States and coming into the United States. And you might recall, Roland, there was a movement back in the 1950s called the John Birch Society.
Yep.
And the Birchers were a group of white supremacist, aligned neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klansmen, and white upper middle class and middle class who believed in white supremacy as, you know, almost a form of corporatism. Now, because the World War II saw the rise of fascism, they didn't want to take on the symbols of fascism. They maintained that America itself was a uniquely white identity. And they were, of course, thoroughly sidelined leading up into the nomination of Barry Goldwater for president in the 1960s. They were sidelined. Only until the period of Donald Trump had groups like the John Birch Society just been ignored.
Right.
Now they're mainstreamed.
And in fact, Congressman Benny Thompson has sent a letter to the FBI and Department of Justice saying that they have failed to brief lawmakers on the fact that more domestic terrorism suspects, white folks, were arrested in the United States over the last 2 years than foreign Islamic extremists.
Absolutely. And last year, not one American was killed in an act of terrorism in the United States by a foreign or foreign-inspired extremist. But there were numerous Americans massacred, most notably the massacre in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, which was carried out by a pro-Trump white nationalist, and the attempted bombing and decapitation of the entire Democratic Party establishment by that amateur bomber out of Florida. This isn't new, but, in the 1990s, we had a huge boom. In 1980s and 90s, there was a huge boom of militiamen and white supremacist-backed groups who were going to, prepare themselves for the white, versus black race war. Timothy McVeigh's bombing of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City was precisely that. He expected that when he blew that building up, his book, The Turner Diaries, the one that he loved and loved reading, was supposed to be the clarion call for all whites in the military to take their guns and mass murder the blacks in the military and thus start a race war.
On that very point, a HuffPost investigation has identified 7 U.S. military members who belong to a white nationalist group. ProPublica's also identified the white nationalists. And we have individuals right now who are serving in the United States military who they've aligned themselves with white nationalists, with neo-Nazi groups, and it is a problem as we speak.
Yeah, and it's old school, too, because the neo-Nazis front other groups, the more traditionalist groups that have gone out of existence, like very little known groups, the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord, which was an all-white Southern group, which was advocating for, civil war in the United States. They said everyone should go into the military to gain those ground skills, and then you can come out and train people. There's a militia right now, an anti-government militia, pro-Trump, but anti-government, that is being trained by ex-special forces soldiers to be prepared for the coming civil war, or, which is now being masked in that if Trump gets denied a second term, right? Well, we all know what it's really for. Another interesting thing is, I'm a gun guy, right? I have guns. I practice, because I used to live over in the Middle East. So these things were a tool of my intelligence and military trade. But, when these people talk about zombie targets and zombie-type ammunition, they're not talking about from The Walking Dead. They're referring to that as when rule of law collapses in a national crisis. The zombies are the black and brown people they expect to come from the cities. And, this is how they think. And now they think that they have a presidential champion that will turn the military and biker gangs to their advantage in a race war.
So true.
You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com.